From the HBA Podcast Studio in New York City, welcome to The Medium Rules. I'm Alan Baldishin. How you guys are sort of solving that pain for both brands and producers of podcasts.
So we ended up building a research tool at first that just basically pull ads out of podcasts that says like who is baseline, who's actually in the market, who's actually buying podcast ads.
Any sense of where future M&A is going to come from in podcasting?
What Spotify ends up doing, because they have some big decisions to make about, what they're going to do with exclusive content, how they're going to interact with the paid users for Spotify, and then seeing how Apple reacts to that.
On today's episode of The Medium Rules, we're going to talk current and future trends in podcasts and pod tech, and we're going to cover a lot of ground. Joined in the HBA Podcast Studio today for this conversation, all the way up fresh from Boston this morning, by Andy Pellett and Sean Creeley, the co-founders of Podsights, which is a cross-platform analytics and attribution service for all the players in the podcast industry. So Sean, Andy, thanks for joining me and our listeners on The Medium Rules. And how's your morning so far?
I was the last person on the train, but happy to be here.
Yeah. I was the first person on the train, so that tells you something about us.
All right, good. Okay. So very quick background on you guys. We've known each other. Sean, you and I have known each other for a while. You were the founder of Embedly, an analytics tool for publishers and brands to track rich content embeds on the publishing web. Embedly counted Reddit, LinkedIn, Salesforce, and Microsoft as clients and partners, and was ultimately sold to Medium in 2016. Andy, you worked for Sean as an analytics engineer at Embedly, and then joined Sean at Podsights as a co-founder. So just sort of jumping in, was it Embedly that led to Podsights? Was it an interest in podcasting? What kind of was the origin story for you guys to sort of get into this business?
Sure. I mean, we did not start in podcasting, period. Like, we started on social. We had a buddy that was doing social ads, and they were just retargeting all over the place and weren't all that affected. So he built some like crazy machine learning stuff that, pulled in all these events and then built audiences based off of, who was more likely to buy, that kind of thing. And it was awesome, except nobody wanted it.
This is post-Embedly?
Post-Embedly.
Okay.
Post-Embedly. And then we started talking to people, and they were like, if you want a challenge, go talk to the podcast advertising guys, because it is a shit show over there.
Okay.
And that's what we did. So we ended up building a research tool at first that just basically pull ads out of podcasts that says like who is baseline, who's actually in the market, who's actually buying podcast ads. And then after that, we got hooked up with Sarah, who does our partnerships, and she was like, oh, and there's a whole other layer here of just reporting downloads, right? So if you had an advertiser on the Medium Rules, the way you would do it is you would send them a screenshot of an admin panel afterwards to say you got 10,000 downloads, which is crazy in 2019, right? Like you think about the tools that digital marketers are used to these days, right? So Facebook, you can tell how many people clicked on a link from Ohio between the hours of 2 and 3 that looked at individual ads, right? Versus podcast advertising, where it was like, we think that you got this many downloads, but that might be inflated because of the way that our hosting provider counts downloads. So never mind how many people came to this site, right? So yeah, I mean, podcasting is interesting because it's not radio and it's not digital, and it's some fuzzy between the two, which is super interesting for us because it's like what you do it for, right? It's for storytelling. It's for getting a high ad recall on an advertisement or an idea, but the actionable, it's not actionable, just period. So we just sit in the middle there and try to listen to a bunch of signals to say, was this effective or was it not effective? And we've had some pretty good success, and it is really effective.
Putting together the technology. So Andy, let me ask you this. So, maybe if you can give a little bit of it, without getting too technical, as best you can, give a little bit of information on how you guys are sort of solving that pain for both brands and producers of podcasts, and where you guys sit sort of in the tech stack, so to speak,
Sure.
of the podcasting ecosystem.
Yeah. So, like Sean said, if you're doing marketing in 2019, you expect all these tools from Facebook, from Google, from Twitter.
If you being a brand.
You as an
a
advertiser
CMO
or a brand.
at
Yeah, exactly.
Unilever.
Right. Like you want all this data. Like,
Right.
This is how you make decisions. Like, where are you going to spend money? You're going to spend money in the places that are converting for you, right? Podcasting has been blowing up. I mean, I've been listening to podcasts since early 2000s, right? But since Serial happened, they've gotten a lot bigger. So now a lot of big brands are getting into it. People are super engaged, right? Like, if you want to listen to a podcast about notebooks or stationery, there's a podcast for that.
Right.
So there's just all these really nice niche opportunities. So basically what we came in, and this was a learning experience as we went, right? Like, we didn't start out saying this is what we're going to do, but we just sort of found these opportunities along the way. So we basically do two things. We have the integration with the podcast side, which is like a technical thing on the back end. We get included in the RSS feed. So when a user downloads a podcast, we hear about it. And then we have a separate integration with the brand. So we also have a relationship there. And they do an integration in JavaScript on their brand website or their apps. And basically they can say, so our job here is to say, okay, we saw this data over here on the websites. We saw this data on the podcasters. We put it together and we say, okay, here's how many people we think heard this ad that you ran, and here's how many people we think actually converted on it, actually viewed a product, put a product in a cart, made a purchase, etc. from there.
Okay. And you use what tools to be able to kind of extrapolate those?
Oh, like technically.
Yeah.
Just a lot of modern tech.
Is it AI? I mean, are you using sort of algorithms in there to make sort of predictions and probabilities, or is it
there's a little bit of a non-deterministic aspect. So the whole idea of saying, all right, this person made this section on the website, this person downloaded this podcast. If it was simple one-to-one mapping, it would be easy.
It would be easy, and you wouldn't have a business.
Company.
Right,
Exactly. So yeah, there is some sort of modeling that we do to say, in cases where it's not an obvious one-to-one connection, we say, okay, based on similar behavior, based on some patterns, there's some secret sauce in there that helps us do what we do.
And let me step back, Andy, because in preparing with you guys for this podcast, and I'll just sort of hold this up.
No. I would have made that look so much nicer.
You gave me an amazing sort of flow chart, with your permission.
I am not
I'm
a designer.
Give you a second bite
by
at the
any
cherry,
chance.
by the way. You can resend us this because we'll actually drop it in as a slide to the video portion of the podcast on YouTube. Quick plug. The videos of these are amazing. Walk me through, you talked about RSS feeds. We know there are producers, there are hosts, there are analytics companies. Try and just draw that picture a little bit so that as we go forward, we try and sort of chunk out the players.
Absolutely, I'll nail down the players. It's an interesting space, right? Because it is this distributed thing. These RSS feeds, like this was the basis of how podcasting came together. RSS used to be big for people consuming news. It's kind of fallen off recently, but
it feels like it's web 1.5.
Yeah,
not even 2.0.
It's RSS has some interesting history. But because of that, there's like distinct companies at each point of the thing versus like a vertically integrated company that just kind of runs the whole stack, right? So Apple is heavily involved. They're like 2/3 of the downloads of all podcasts go through the Apple Podcast app. But that's just one part of the ecosystem. So it's not like Apple owns everything there. Okay, so there's three main parts, right? So there's people like you that are making a podcast. You're producing the content. You bring folks in. You get this together, record the show, record the content. The next question is, how do you make that available to your thousands of listeners, right? So there's this whole
tens of thousands,
hundreds of thousands soon for sure.
There's a movement going on.
So how do you make this available to all those people? So there's an entire segment of the industry called podcast hosts. So these are companies like Art19, like Pippa, Megaphone. There's literally probably like 30 of them.
Are there that many?
There are a lot, yeah. And you wouldn't think that there was a lot of room for differentiation, but people that do podcasts are there's a lot of different niches in podcasts, and there's a lot of different things that those podcasters like. And so some way or another, a lot of these companies manage to exist, and and do okay for themselves.
Okay.
So that's how you get it out to people. The next question is, how do people find your podcast and how do they listen to it? And that's going to be the app. So that's Apple's podcast app, which they're revamping recently. They're making it a dedicated app. So they're kind of buying into the ecosystem there.
I thought it was a dedicated app.
You're right, it was, but they're also making a dedicated app on desktop, right? So they're killing iTunes and they're making podcasts, TV, and something else.
Interesting.
There's a bunch of like sort of one-off ones that people love for one reason or another. There's also other big players like Spotify, and yeah, there's just a lot of them, right? So those are the three main things, right? So you have people making the content, people hosting the content, and people a way to consume the content, right?
Okay. And somewhere in there fits guys like you and brands that are trying to do what we do in a capitalistic society, is make money off people consuming content.
Yeah.
Which is no great shock.
You know,
I mean, let's not go bananas here. There's nothing wrong with it.
There's one company that has gotten a lot of press recently for putting out a controversial tweet about what was it? Podcasts don't need ads.
Oh, this is Luminary, which is just a hot shit show.
Shit show, to use your phrase, which we will get into. I
so
called that early on. I just want to say, Matt Sachs,
they put out this Twitter meme
Elliot.
of podcasts don't need ads, and they got a ton of backlash over it, which is interesting. I mean,
they thought they were actually doing a public service.
They thought it was going to blow up for them, and it went the wrong way.
Yeah, the irony is dripping off that. Well, we'll get into that and why. So, how is it going at Podsights? Not saying how's your business going in a kind of a, but I mean, how are you finding the responsiveness from those various players in terms of, let's say, brands, in terms of, let's say, producers, in terms of, are people really craving this? Are they struggling to understand it?
So there's like three big players here, and I'll let Sean take the last one. The first two are the hosting companies that have been really receptive to it, in part because the podcasters want it. Like, you do a podcast, you really want to know how it's doing. And the next step beyond that is, if you're doing ads, you want to know how they're doing. You want to do a better job, be able to sell more ads. So that side loves it. The brands love it because, again, they expect all this other reporting from all their other channels. And we're saying, okay, we can do this for podcasting. And then the other side is the agencies. I'll let Sean talk about it.
Before is your business, is it a SaaS business in effect?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, to the point where we're making it self-serve, right? So if you wanted to go in, sign up, run an attribution campaign, like, we'll have you. We'd love to have you.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's a messy ecosystem as well, right? Because everybody's sort of, right? Everybody views it as almost a zero-sum game, where if you're making money selling ads, then it means that they're not spending on my podcast, et cetera, but it's really not, right? Like, it's not. So it's
no more or less than any content business,
right?
I think would be the fair way to say it. I mean,
exactly. From 100% of the people that have used the product have returned and bought more advertising using the product, which is sort of the best indicator that we have that it's working, which we like, obviously. It's hard to sell podcast advertising. So publisher sales teams are who we interact with the most, because they're out there day to day trying to convince brands that have never bought podcasts before to buy podcasts. And there's just one moment in that presentation where the brand will basically say, well, how do I know if it's working? And that's when they like us, because they're like, oh, we've got a tool for that. We'll set you up. No big deal. These guys will help you measure the performance, which is great. So that's sort of where we fit into the market, is to answer that one singular question in one. Like, there's a great story that goes into a podcast pitch on every single one, and it's not based on analytics, or it's not based on attribution, right? It's based off storytelling, which we love, right? It's based off of, this is my content, this is how I reach my my users, and this is why they trust me, because I have this great relationship with them, that they've listened to my voice for hours upon hours, like, right? Like, loyal listeners to you, right? Like, trust you implicitly because of the fact that they've heard you so much. Mm-hmm. And they tell that story, which is great, and that's how they make their living, which is phenomenal. Like, that's one one of the reasons why we love this business is because it's not purely attribution or analytics. It's based off of stories. We just help sort of complete that story a little bit more by saying, like, this is a great podcast. You should buy this podcast, and we'll show that it works. Like, we've seen some crazy results for these, right? Like, 5x ROAS, right? So every dollar you spent, you get 5 back in revenue. That's obviously a well-performing campaign, but even some of the smaller ones, like it's above 1, which is all that matters. And before, you would see a lot of churn in podcast advertising. So you'd get a Google, you'd get a large brand to come in and buy a whole chunk, and then because they had no idea whether it worked or not, they churn. They'd say like, we'll spend the money elsewhere where we know we're getting results, right? Like if you had to pick between digital and podcasting, you're going to choose, and you care about metrics, you're going to choose digital all day long because you can tell what a conversion rate is. Yeah. Well, how much did I pay for a click through? Podcasting, it's a little squishier, where you see some of these smaller consumer brands, just make hay because the ZipRecruiters of the world or Blue Aprons for a very long time, right? Because they saw customer acquisition costs so low that they're like, all day long. So from our perspective, like we don't really we don't talk a ton about metrics, right? Like that's one side of the story, but the other side of the story is mostly around content. It's about reaching people where they're most engaged. There's the idea of sort of like an attention minute, right? And if I can grab someone's attention for 1 minute, that should be transferable from audio to video to digital, right? And audio is just such a compelling medium.
Right. I agree. You've really got somebody's attention in a one-to-one way, because most often it's somebody with their listening with their earbuds.
Absolutely.
And they're not going anywhere. So
no. For hours.
I should know the answer I should know the answer to this question. I think, but where does programmatic enter the equation, or doesn't it, with respect to podcast advertising and podcast?
Yeah, Andy's going to answer this one, but yeah.
Andy?
So that's sort of one of the the evolutions of where podcast advertising is going, right? So
it's going, but it's not there yet.
It is, yeah.
Oh, it is
absolutely
there.
Right.
Okay.
So originally it's like somebody calls you up, pays you a couple $100 to drop a spot, you guys record it. But now there's a couple companies out there that will do, we have this entire inventory of ads and in real time, as people go to download your podcasts, based on who we think they are, we'll serve a different ad into the podcast. It's interesting because
is it being run through exchanges?
Not yet.
Okay.
Yeah, not yet. But there are so there's a couple companies doing that. There's still sort of an open question of the sort of like baked in ads that originally were in podcasts still perform really well. And so there's like a segment of people that's that's not going away. Basically.
Okay.
It's mostly about scale. So it's really tedious to buy podcast advertising because you have to, if you're doing a ton of small shows, like you have to negotiate with every single one. You got to, make sure that it's all working. Dynamic insertion is awesome for scale, right? Yeah. So if I want to buy $3 million worth of podcast ads, right, how am I going to do that if I've got to reach out to...
And also for people. Back catalogs. That's another thing, right? So this episode 3 years from now, people might want to listen to it, and there's still going to be, even if somebody's listening to the New York Times or the Daily from a year ago, they're still listening to it. So there's room for that.
Yep. Which I feel like is, well, I guess it's true of the long tail and content across all digital sort of, but especially podcast seemed right for that.
Right,
and because there's so much and it's becoming so searchable
and it's considered evergreen content, right? Like Serial is still an interesting story no matter what,
right?
S-Town, How Stuff Works literally makes their living off of this because How Stuff Works episode doesn't really change all that much from the time it was published till now. So definitely.
So wanted to sort of move on just to talk about, and we're sort of getting there, sort of current trends, and some people have commented on the dominance of the Apple player, iTunes player, sort of declining, and some of these, I wouldn't say upstarts, but some other players and some other companies coming to the fore, like Spotify, Pandora, etc. We'll talk in a second about the podcast networks that we touched on there. But what are you guys seeing, if anything, with respect to the dominance of Apple, which I guess had been sort of what 2/3 of people use to get their podcasts? Are you seeing that, and if so, what is it? How do you interpret it? Or
I just think it's super interesting what Spotify's doing from a pure customer acquisition cost to them, right? Like we think about sort of how. Right, think about how acquire users all the time, and from Spotify's perspective, they now have podcasts, especially like they now have this giant catalog of things to listen to that they didn't have to pay for. Right, compare that with how much they're spending for music. Right, with podcasts, it's nothing to them, right? So if I can engage a user via a podcast on my app, like the next step for them is to move music over there, or the same other way around, in that I can engage them for longer by diversifying my content, right? So do we think that they spent a lot of money in podcasting, right? So they bought Gimlet for $200 million. And
I mean, they also want exclusive original content, but
and that's where Luminary comes in, and you can talk about that all day long. And just to go on the record, like, long pause.
Yes, you had me in the pregnant pause. I'll go on the record
all this
about
competition
Luminary.
is awesome in the space, right? The more money that people spend on producing content means that more people are going to be listening content, and then when they're done with that content, they're going to go find somebody else's content. They're going to listen to that too, right? So, do we think that Luminary rolled out in quite the interesting way? Yes, right. They could have done better than that.
Yeah.
But they've sort of kept their heads down at this point. Like, you haven't seen them their
screw up again.
Well, yeah. Like, I always like to imagine that they have a sign that says like days since last PR incident. And that number's going up, right? That number's going up.
Yep.
Which it's got to feel good over there.
Yeah.
So I mean, the problem is that they're such an easy punching bag, and a lot of people sort of are starting to punch down on them. But at the same time, I think they're doing innovative things in the space.
Me too.
Yeah.
I completely agree. I Andy, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it kind of lit a fire at Apple a little bit. Like, all of a sudden, Spotify came in, made some big moves. Luminary, they've got a ton of backing, and all of a sudden, Apple was like, okay, we're gonna put this in its own silo. We're gonna put focus on it. And also they're doing some interesting stuff with the analytics stuff too. So they're kind of in a weird place. Apple as a company.
You haven't even talked about Google yet, too.
No,
yeah.
Let's get to that.
Well, that's kind of a mess too.
But while we're here, I think it's interesting because Steve Jobs was a big podcast booster and sort of predictor. He was very bullish on what he thought podcasts were going to become. Apple is not necessarily a content company, we know, but it's gotten sort of more and more sucked into. And I don't want to say sucked in, or they want to be in that business, but they're going to have to. I guess maybe they're being pushed into creating content.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if they do, I mean, they can be the 800-pound gorilla.
Exactly. I mean, they have this hold, right?
And they have the brand, and they have the money, and they have the player, and the list, and they could sort of put a dome down and kind of keep everyone in there.
And they should have done it 2 years ago.
Well, it's really interesting to watch
and
them
that's
fight
sort of,
with
I think,
Spotify
Andy's
now,
point.
right?
Yeah.
But you know what I think's interesting, and my knock on Luminary is not related to their rollout, which, as you said, Sean, like, they're a punching bag. They raised a lot of money in venture. There are a lot of independent podcasters and small guys who got in the podcasting business when it was ham radio, and they're
Indies.
like, who are these interlopers, and they're just rooting for them to fail, and sure, like, there's definitely a lot of that. I more see it as the Awesomeness TV Maker Studios issue, that I think that it's very difficult to just wake up one morning and create content from the top down. I think that is what's going to be their challenge.
But they didn't, right? They just went and bought the top players.
Right, but who knows if those top players are going to be the top players in
Yeah.
a year, 2 years.
Fair,
and,
right?
you know,
Hits-driven business and all, right? Like, no one saw Serial doing what it does, never mind like Atlanta Monster or,
Right.
Wondery has a bunch of shows
Amazing
that are
shows.
just monsters as
By
well.
the way, did you listen to the American Gladiator one about
Aaron
Hernandez as a Boston
Oh
guy?
yeah. Oh yeah.
It's insane.
Yeah.
It's such a good
Unreal.
podcast. I gotta say, Wondery does a great job. And the one on Spitzer was really good too.
Yeah.
We'll get to our favorites at the end, but by Wondery. Yeah, that was more my knock on them. Is that I thought that the barriers to entry of making content and podcasting are so low, unlike Netflix, or Amazon Prime, unlike the streaming wars, where not anyone can wake up, and what Netflix did to disrupt content, was so much more difficult, and the staying power and the legs there are so much greater because it's so expensive to produce really good content. And using sort of a public company model in the way they did and raising so much money, I think that Luminary is going to struggle because they're trying to make hits, or pick hits. And I don't know. I think that's what's difficult.
Interesting.
Yeah. That's my take.
Yeah, I
is
mean,
that
that-
it's a little bit of a maker studios getting funded and bought by Disney. And it's like you're relying on YouTube creators.
Yeah.
Yes, they were big a year ago, and maybe you got the bigger YouTube creators, but there's a gazillion other YouTube creators out there.
But I also think there's this misunderstanding of how much it costs to actually create really good audio.
That's fair.
Right?
That's fair. And there are higher end studios. Yep.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
This compared to what a Wondery does, a Radio Lab, or the polish that they put on it,
Right,
on
the
a
work
show
after the
compared
show,
to my dumb voice, right?
Yeah,
is
You're right.
so yes, I get your point that there's a lot of, but there's obviously space in the video market for
High
Netflix
end,
and
medium
YouTube,
end, yeah,
right?
that's
Exactly.
true. Yeah.
So
And maybe that's the point.
I'm less I think they will do well, right? Considering that how much they're spending to create great content, right? Eventually, but it's a long-term bet. It's an incredibly long-term bet. So it's whether they have the stomach to do it for the 10 years that it's going to take for this whole industry to turn around. Not turn around, but grow as expected.
Yeah, to back up that level.
Versus videos, obviously, there's so many hours a day that you can be listening to podcasts, right? Versus something that video that's slightly more engaging sometimes. I don't know.
Yeah.
Those are just.
So it's interesting. We'll see how it evolves. Andy, you were gonna.
Oh, I was just gonna say. I mean, that's been the pitch for more than one company, right? We're gonna be the Netflix of podcasting.
Yeah.
But for them to come in and raise that much money was
Good for them.
Interesting. Yeah. Certainly you don't knock them. And
But
listen, as you guys know as founders, I mean, just putting everything else aside, that is not easy to pull off. I mean, to go from I'm going to do this to I'm $100 million funded company, actually really a huge player. I mean, that you cannot.
Yeah, exactly.
Easy to knock. Go try and do it.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's some sort of NIMBY stuff going on with podcasts too, where it's we were here first, we're the whatever, so we're not in my backyard kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I think people need to understand that there's going to be if the more content the better, the more people that are in the space the better, the more competition for those ears the better,
right.
because
it's
it's
growing
just
the
gonna
pie, right?
raise everybody. But at the same time, when a creator sees someone has $1 million budget for a show versus them in a garage trying to do stuff I can see how it can be quite disheartening at the same time.
So related to that, and we touched on it, there was some significant M&A acquisition activity earlier this year with Spotify picking up Gimlet, Anchor, and then I think Parcast.
Yep.
Any sense of where future M&A is going to come from in podcasting, or what that sort of consolidation might look like?
Music studios.
Meaning?
I don't know. I think that you always look at adjacent industries when you start talking about that, and like people that would benefit from coming into a podcast space. You're seeing Sony do it already. They just invested/spun out a unit to do podcasting with Planet Money guy, I forget his name, Adam Davison. Stuff like that I think you're gonna see also in our business. Like you'll talk to the big ad tech players in digital, and they look at this and be like, that's a nice little market, maybe we should go into that little market. But then they get completely disheartened because it's not as clean cut as digital is, and then they sort of go back into their hole, and then they come back in 2 years after another serial comes out, that kind of thing. And it gets another hype cycle, and then it dies down, hype cycle, die down, whatever. So yeah, even Netflix is looking at podcasts, right? So stuff like that, where you just see adjacent industries, and take Wondery's model, right? They produce shows that will eventually make it to TV someday, right? Like, and iHeart is taking some of the same approach here, where they're taking content that it's like, someone called it the new screenplay or the new script, right? Where if I can produce a podcast for relatively small dollars, and that does really well, I know that there's a much larger market out there on the TV side of things, that if I can make it a movie. Limetown did the exact same thing with Facebook Watch, right? So going from audio into screen is the same thing. So as movie studios, like, 20th Century Fox was an investor in Wondery, right? Like, you're going to probably see more.
Makes sense. I mean, if you look at any pitch deck for any startup podcast studio, they have that life cycle of rights baked in. That's 100%. So presumably you will see that coming back down that food chain,
right?
To pick these guys up, the more successful ones. And Andy, look into your crystal ball.
I'm interested to see. I guess I'm looking at kind of the bigger side of this, like what Spotify ends up doing, because they have some big decisions to make about, what they're going to do with exclusive content, how they're going to interact with the paid users for Spotify, and then seeing how Apple reacts to that, because, right, so they're moving more into services right now, right? So, and content as well. So I could see them sort of staking their claim in the space.
And like Gimlet and Podcast makes sense to me. Anchor makes no sense.
Anchor's interesting, right? Like Anchor's thing is
Spotify.
Making it easy, like making it super easy to just put together a podcast for anybody.
But they're a hosting company, and like they have one of the more innovative ad tech projects out there in podcasting right now, right?
Which is what?
Host read ads. But they basically you buy and you basically give a script, and the host self reads it, so they can go out and say like, I think I want Sunbasket today, and they go and read Sunbasket's script, and then Sunbasket pays them for the thing, right? For the ad. Which the problem with podcast ads is always scale. So if you look at how that works out, like that's a very interesting way to solve scale, right? Now has.
But that way, that's interesting.
Now, who knows if that's working? But in theory, it's super interesting from just a scale problem.
Yeah.
Right. That's always one of the big questions, is like, what's actually working? People are doing a lot of stuff. What's actually working? And that's kind of part of where we come in, right?
Yeah. Gotcha.
But yeah, I mean, I love that. Like, that seems super interesting to me. But who knows?
There's a fair bit, online and on the various boards and Reddit threads and so on and so forth, sort of a political dimension about podcasting. And, Sean, your NIMBY comment, I think, is sort of touches on it. Do you think there's a risk of, just in terms of the content, the sort of oversaturation and people sort of tuning out, and a kind of anxiety of too many choices going on? Do you think that's a phenomenon out there? Or is your view, as you've said, just the more content, the better, period?
We look at it from a number of different angles. So yeah, there's content getting better, but in order for content to reach more people, deliverability needs to be better, right? So how you actually listen to a podcast. These are smart speakers. These are AirPods. These are, Android Auto, iOS Auto
Your refrigerator.
integrations. Your refrigerator can be that podcast. So that also helps a ton. So, it's still less than, half of all U.S. Americans listen to a podcast, and on Daily Month, like stuff like that. So as deliverability gets better, there's going to be more room for the content. As discoverability gets better, so how do I find that next awesome podcast to listen to gets better, there's more room for content. And then there's obviously, in our minds, there's more room for advertisements in that content.
And I think that makes a lot of sense especially for like the big sort of blockbuster shows that everybody's going to see, right? Like Serial. But I'm always like super amazed when I talk to people and ask them what podcasts they listen to. Like 75% of the time, I've never heard of it before. They're like, everybody has a podcast. It's unbelievable. So like whatever niche you're into, like whatever, like like E-list celebrity from some reality TV show probably has a podcast about it. Like whatever show you're watching, there's a podcast about it. So you're right. Like there's no way that you can listen to every podcast, right?
But the depth is there when people want it.
That's
Which is
for
super
sure.
interesting.
That's for sure.
Yeah. Like, and to your point about the cost, right? Production costs of making a video series is what, like 10x of doing it. Maybe I have no idea, but podcasting is way cheaper. Right. And so if you want to do if you want to do a show, if you want to do 3 shows about some random TV show or an NBA team or whatever, you can do it, and there's going to be people that really like that content, and you're going to have that strong audience. And to the point about the notebooks,
so backstory here. Like when we first started, we created, we needed a product to test stuff against. So like our retargeting or our Facebook ads, social, whatever. So we ended up manufacturing and printing about 1,000 journals, notebooks in northern New Hampshire.
Like physical notebook.
Physical notebooks, and these things are awesome. So awesome that Drift just bought like 3,000 of them. It was awesome.
Seriously?
Yeah. Swear to God.
Did you bring any with you? Kind of want one now.
My gosh, we'll get you one for sure.
Anyway, so not a good business investment. We've lost money on it. But when we went to go test podcast ads, we went and bought podcast ads against these notebooks. Yeah. All of them were ROAS positive. We made money on those
spends.
Ads. Yeah, because it was like the Erasable podcast, a podcast for people that are into colored pencils, and like other things around, literally the colored pencil podcast.
Isn't it amazing?
And these are the people that want this stuff, right?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. So
who wants it more than the person who listens to a colored pencil podcast?
Exactly. And that was just eye opening for us, because we were like, who knows that there was literally thousands of people listening to these things about pencils, but the podcast hosts loved it too, because they got to monetize a little bit.
I remember
they're not whatever, but they're covering hosting fees, they're covering some of their time, and they're solid beer money.
I mean, back in the early days of kind of Facebook, when it didn't cost you an arm and a leg to run native, one of our clients, Craftsy, had knit in there as sort of online courses. They got sold to NBC. They had a great outcome. But when they were first starting out, they were running Facebook ads because they had a course on knitting, right? And they were able to target all the knitting groups on Facebook.
Yep.
Right.
And it was like bing, bing, sale, sale, sale. I remember being at dinner with one of the founders, and he was just like, bing, it was just like, it was so effective, that level of targeting, obviously, as you would expect. I mean, that's such an anachronistic example, but it's one that, it shouldn't be lost, that sort of magic of being able to target that narrow.
And that's why a lot of people will come and say, like, well, I want to buy podcast ads. How do I do it, right? And we just tell them it's all about content. It's about finding the content that your users are going to be most interested in, and going to find those people and saying, like, hey, can I give you some money?
I had Troy Young on this podcast, president of First Magazine. He was talking about smart content and putting content in front of people where they want it, what they want it, and it's the same with ads. You're trying to find a way to get the ad in front of the people who's going to be most interested in that thing. And this is sort of what you're talking about. I mean, it's
Yeah.
at its most basic level.
Right, and the other thing is that we don't do, like, people will say that they can do demographics, but can't really do demographics in podcasting, right? But you can do, psychographics. You can do, like, what that person is interested in. And when that hits hard.
Yeah.
Which is really cool to see.
Have you guys seen, just in your travels around podcasting, any new forms of content that sort of jump out at you as being innovative? It's sort of somewhat of an off-the-wall question.
Yeah, I mean... I don't actually know how a podcast gets made other than sitting in this room right now, right? Like, we don't sort of play in that means. So yeah, like, people.
I can think of
it's
one
hilarious when everybody starts talking to me about actually producing content.
So we actually, as Podsights, we have done a podcast before. I forgot about this, but in early April, we put out a podcast of basically the greatest hits of some of the larger brand advertisers. So we did a 4-part podcast series.
Okay.
It's not cool.
It's actually
it's not cool.
It was pretty cool. Yeah, it's a pretty strong reception on this. So the first episode was 45 minutes of hosts saying ZipRecruiter that we cut out of like thousands and thousands of episodes of podcasts.
That's wild.
It's surprisingly therapeutic.
That is surprising.
What did we call it?
I'm looking it up right now. You can edit this part out, but let me tell you, it is going to be, you're going to love this.
Yeah, you got to play a clip of it. What did we call it? We released it on April 1st.
And who did you use as
your... The weekly skip.
The weekly skip, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Who did you use as your host?
We put it on SoundCloud, actually.
Oh,
that was
okay.
the quickest and easiest for us, yeah. Because we generated the file. We didn't record anything. We generated it. And that was easiest to just upload an MP3 and go from there.
Sean, you're going to play us put it in the...
Quip.
It goes on for like 45 minutes.
Really?
Yeah.
Simon Endeavor.
But
actually, on one of my earlier podcasts, I had an investor in Quip talking all about that story, about how they kind of... Because I just think their Subway ads are so wild. Whoever would... and they do all those radio reads, too.
Yeah.
All right, so we're talking about content. We're talking about new forms of content. By way of wrapping up, we knew we were going to get here. What are some of the podcasts that you guys are listening to now? What's on your list? Give some recommendations for Friday here.
Yeah, so the first podcast that I ever listened to is like a long time ago. It's This Week in Tech, the Twit Network. And this was like back in the day, like, I didn't know anything about tech, and actually it was funny because this was probably in like 2000 and like mid 2000s. And so Twit, the guy who runs the networks, Leo Laporte, they actually had this big copyright dispute with Twitter because Twitter was getting big at that time. And there was this controversy between Twit, the network, and Twitter. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. So they had a big dispute about that.
Yeah.
That was early on.
Twitter's really nice about those types of things.
Well, they settled for a while, and then when Twitter released Twitter Video, it kicked it all up again because they had some deal about if you guys don't do media content, then
right.
Anyways, so then I listened to a ton of Radiolab. That was great, and that was like, talk about like one of the first podcasts that was just like really well produced, and like really well researched, really good stories, super cool.
Yep.
Freakonomics, and then the one that I listened to most recently that's my current favorite is Econ Talk with Russ Roberts. Kind of a niche podcast, but super interesting.
Econ as in the economy?
Economics, yeah.
Economics,
yeah.
okay.
So like
is it academic or is it
Yeah,
political?
It's pretty dry,
okay.
but it's pretty interesting. And then, like...
yeah, I'm tuning into that one. Let me run to...
It can't be dry and it.
Trust me, you'll like it. But then runner-up, so... Lance Armstrong has a podcast talking about everybody has a podcast. Lance Armstrong has a podcast.
I have to listen to that one.
He has some great episodes. So did you ever see the...
Does he come clean on his podcast, or is he still running around denying everything? I know he already did come clean, but...
But yeah, he talks about it. So did you see the documentary Icarus on Netflix?
No.
Amazing documentary.
Really?
So good. You actually
all about Lance and his story?
No, so it's about this guy, I can't remember his name. I think his
oh,
first
no,
name is Chris.
I did watch
that.
So
he
the
did
Russian
an amateur cyclist competition, and it complete, like 30 minutes into the podcast, not to ruin it, completely changes scope, right? To what you're
into
talking about.
into the doc on Netflix, right?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
it starts off as this guy wants to dope for an amateur cycling race and see
Yeah.
if he can get away with it. And then the guy who he ends up working with to figure out how to dope is like the head,
The main
of
Russian guy,
of the Russian ADA or
Right.
anti-doping, and it becomes this crazy story, so interesting,
Okay.
and like still kind of going on to this day. Anyways, so Lance did a two-part follow-up podcast with the guy who made this documentary. Great, yeah, I listened to it. He basically tells a guy that like 75% of the stuff that he did in doping he didn't need to do.
Really? Really?
So he was doping wrong? Is that
Yeah,
what
he was
Lance
like,
was
you were
saying?
like putting needles
The
places that you
results,
didn't need to, and all
pretty
this
good.
stuff. And he lost the race that the guy doped for.
Oh, really?
Anyways, which is funny. But so yeah, Lance Armstrong podcast, Econ
Okay.
Talk, shout out.
Okay. All
And
right.
also, the Wondery, the Aaron Hernandez thing was super
I
awesome.
thought that was amazing.
Yeah.
I'll tell you who came out looking the worst there, in my opinion, was the Gators and Urban Meyer. You know, because that's supposed to be an academic institution. I mean, Belichick, it's pro football.
Yeah.
We know it's a meat market. You know, we know there are basically slabs of meat. But like to pull the kid out, it's not to go too deep on that one. It's a great.
Yeah, it's
You know,
super
yeah,
compelling.
I thought that was very damning.
yeah.
Sean, you're.
I think that Aaron Hernandez is the one that is the big problem in that story. But
Yeah, but it's an interesting story about the sort of the stops along the way where his serious issues could have been should have been
Right.
flagged.
It was a while
and
coming.
who didn't do it.
Yeah.
And you're right, easy to start pointing fingers. But what are you listening to?
yeah, I'm really boring. I'll listen to the daily on my smart speaker in the morning while I'm making my coffee and all the other fun stuff. And then generally like Pushkin industry, like the highly narrative, highly produced shows are sort of like catnip to me.
They're so well done.
Right. So like Michael Lewis just did his show.
I've not listened to it.
Super interesting if you're into highly narrative that is super biased. So Against the Rules. Bear Brook out of New Hampshire Public Radio is an awesome story.
Okay.
It plays as a like.
Is it a true crime?
True crime, but
Okay.
but it talks. But it actually leads into like how they identified the Golden State Killer through all this
You're kidding.
genealogy and whatever.
I just
It's
can't
also New
believe
Hampshire.
the number of true crime podcasts.
It's amazing,
Right.
Right, but at the same
Isn't
time,
it? It's beyond all
It's-
scope and proportion.
Yeah, and I was like, where did this come from?
Yeah.
That's
an interesting.
But
thread.
I was watching. There's like a media
Dirty
recap
John.
show on
Right.
on Netflix, and I think the kind of start was like SVU, like Law and Order SVU, like that TV show.
Right.
And then like as podcasting grew up, they're like, oh, let's do like every true crime story ever, and then obviously Serial.
right. But I look at this from like Spotify's perspective, right? Like they can see how well shows are performing, and then they go out and they buy the content producers.
Well,
of, like,
that's
some of
Netflix.
That's
small,
the
right?
Netflix.
top,
model, yeah,
right?
yeah.
So they bought Gimlet and they bought Parcast, which
yeah.
is all true crime,
Right.
right? So
But-
I just don't
How
think
many
they're
true
dumb.
crime
So-
stories are there?
Okay,
That's
so
the thing.
well, this is the
Unlimited.
thing. There's a lot of
People
laws
kill
out
each
there,
other
right?
all
I
the
guess so.
time.
So we do this. The other side of the business is the research, right? Where we identify ads in all these episodes. And so at some point, I was listening to, we were listening to hundreds of ads per day, and I found at one point there's like this Australian true crime network, like just from everywhere.
Yeah.
It's all over the place.
So are you guys? So are you guys? So you're really obviously you're enjoying your ride in the podcasting universe. You're engaged. You're
Learning a lot.
You're learning a lot, having fun, and you see it growing.
Yeah.
Obviously, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, compared to the last business we did, this is super more interesting, right? It's interesting because it's been around for a while, but a lot of the tech side of it is still pretty nascent, right?
How are you finding here? How are you finding the investor community? Is it tough? Is it just tough, just sort of like endemically because it's podcasting?
So-
you have venture going. Well, Luminary got funded. That's been done. And who are like? Is it still viewed as kind of?
I think one of the big problems is that it's still growing so much, and like if you look at the size of the podcast advertising industry relative to digital or TV or anything else, it's small. So it is harder
Yeah,
to make that
it
argument.
all comes down to a TAM model, right? Everybody wants to see this
Exactly.
TAM model that's
Exactly.
enormous, right? And so venture scale businesses depends on what kind of they
Yeah.
want you to pretend that you're going to be a $1 billion
Exactly.
business. Not very few people actually get to be $1 billion businesses. There's a ton of good opportunities in the $100 million space, right?
Or 50.
Or
If you do
50,
your
or
job right from a founder perspective.
or a
Yeah.
$10 million
Yeah.
company. So you just have to find the right person that has there's like 6 or 7 firms out there that will sink money into podcasting, and then everybody else will just say come back in 6 years or 5 years when it's 3 times its size, that kind of thing.
Yeah, but I mean, there's absolutely there's a ton of growth coming in. The sort of industry places that do projections of where it's going have missed in the past few years that they've projected the growth.
What's it like in outside the U.S., like in Europe and Russia, China?
Yeah.
Asia.
So this has been a story lately, is podcasting in China. People talk about how that market is super huge. And the story there is that it kind of goes beyond what we think of as podcasting in the U.S., where it's a lot of almost educational content and courses, audiobooks.
Himalaya, right? So they actually started a U.S.-based firm, another $100 million, to try to capture the U.S. market. So this is sort of almost the opposite of every single tech company, right? So they started in the U.S. And so these guys did the exact opposite and have a bunch of money to throw at the problem.
Yeah.
Which is,
all right. Well, guys, thank you. It's a great place to
Thanks for
stop,
having
and
us.
would love to have a return visit.
We
see
learned
where
something
this
new.
is going
in 3 to 5 years.
In 3 to 5 years. But thanks for coming in. It's been a great conversation.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Alan.
All right.
Appreciate
Thanks,
it.
Andy. Thanks, Sean.
That's a wrap on this episode of The Medium Rules with Alan Baldachin. For more information, go to our website at www.hballp.com. And you can also follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And don't forget to rate us on Apple Podcasts.